Welcome back, Time Crunch fans. I'm your host, Coach Adam Pulford. Off-season is approaching, if not here, for many of us. Likely, many of you are thinking about your big events for next year and how to take your fitness to the next level in 2024. If that's the case, today's episode and actually the next 3 episodes are just for you. I've been working alongside CTS Premier Coach and our resident Phys Lab expert in all things Phys Lab testing, Renee Eastman, on how we can take a batch of episodes and help educate all of our listeners on the importance of lab testing compared to the nuance of field testing, and then also to get a basic understanding of the underlying mechanisms that are actually working for you or against you when you do the training with the data you have. We thought that going back to the basics would be the best way to do this for the first episode, as many of us still get lost in the weeds when we're talking about aerobic versus anaerobic, FTP versus LT, and all those fun, fancy terms and abbreviations. So without further ado, I bring you Renee Eastman. Renee, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me back, Adam.
Yeah, for sure. Renee is not a rookie on the Time Crunch Cyclist podcast, and she's also no stranger to exercise physiology. For those listeners who didn't catch you on episode 98, where we were talking about all things climbing on the bike, could you tell our listeners a bit more about yourself?
Sure. I have been a coach with Carmichael Training Systems for over 20 years. Might be 22, 23, I don't know. I've held just about every job that you can have at CTS. My primary job is as a coach. And as you mentioned, I've got quite a bit of experience in the Phys Lab. I tried to add it up how many LT VO2 max tests I've done, and we're like in the 500s, easy. Because I started in the mid 90s at the Olympic Training Center. Yeah. That's where I cut my teeth in the Phys Lab. I've got my undergraduate, my master's degree in exercise physiology. I played bike racer for a long time, and now, like I said, primarily a coach, and I do run the Phys Lab. And it seems like a little bit more buzz around the lab the last, couple of years. I'm excited because people are getting interested in finding out a little bit more specifics about their training zone. So that's what I'm hoping that we can share today.
Yeah, and truly, kudos to Renee for reaching out to me and saying, "Hey, I got this idea," and we've taken and run with it. And we've spun it into these, what I think will be 3 episodes. And my last thing before we really jump into it is I want to give a shout out to Corey and Ruddy, the editors and producers of the podcast. And they're always pushing me to refine and keep the process to around 30 minutes per episode. But not going to lie to you, me and Renee are pretty stoked about this. And if we keep it to under 30 minutes, I'll be real surprised. And for our listeners, if we do go a touch long and it's getting long for you, just hit pause and come back when you can, because I promise it'll be worth it. So let's dive in. Renee, I'm going to ask you 2 of the most basic, but perhaps the most tricky and misunderstood questions in exercise physiology. Are you ready for it?
I hope so.
All right. What is lactate?
Lactate is a byproduct of metabolism. Specifically, it's a byproduct of the breakdown of carbohydrates. So, just a little bit about it and why we would even measure it is that as exercise intensity goes up, we need energy a little faster. Carbohydrates break down faster than fats. So generally speaking, as exercise intensity goes up, lactate is going to go up. So I'm jumping on your next question. Why do we measure it? Is because it relates to exercise intensity.
Yeah, to the performance aspect. And so to clarify, lactate deals with our metabolism. So as long as I'm alive, I have some lactate in my body all the time. Is that correct?
Right. And I think that's a misconception about lactate, that it only happens, or you only have it in your blood when you're doing something very hard. No, we have some right now. because we're always using a mixture of fats and carbohydrates. Sometimes we have a little bit more predominantly one or the other, but we're always making it. I think the other misconception that I actually think people are starting to get the messages that lactate's not the bad guy. It's
Right.
not bad at all. It's actually a fuel source. When we break down those carbohydrates and lactate is part of that byproduct, we recycle it and use it for energy. The problem comes is we can only use it so fast. So at some point, it starts to back up. And it's actually not the lactate backing up that's the problem. It's more the hydrogen ions associated and other things about metabolism that are going on when the lactate levels are high. So yeah, lactate's not the bad guy, but like when lactate's high, fatigue is coming down the bend.
Okay. So we've given a nod to it and we're speaking about that fatigue point and whatnot. But in general terms, here's the second tricky question. What is threshold or a threshold?
Which threshold? So, most of the time when us endurance athletes, us cycling endurance athletes are throwing around the term threshold, just kind of blankly, we mean lactate threshold, or it's a very close association to functional threshold power.
Okay.
And when we're talking about that terminology, that means your maximal sustainable effort. For that sustainable being what, 35 to 60, 70 minutes in that, so long sustainable effort. That's what we mostly mean when we say threshold. However, there's a lot of different terms that you might hear. LT1, LT2, OBLA, MLSS, aerobic threshold, anaerobic threshold. Got any other terms in there? We got a lot of terms that have the word threshold in there. Some of them are pretty close relation. Like I said, FTP and lactate threshold, or so another term that somebody might use for lactate threshold might be anaerobic threshold. Yep. Or LT2, like those are some close associations, and they all fall around the term that most of us are familiar with, functional threshold power. They're real close.
Yeah. So I guess like just in general physiology, if you could say a threshold in general, like what's going on at that point to make us decide that it's an important point, like what is going on with the threshold?
When we're talking about it in these terms, we're talking about it's telling us something about our metabolic pathways. What pathways am I using to produce energy? Maybe what like muscle fiber types are helping to produce those energy. And they're important because if we train below, at, above them, we can affect the change on the different ways we produce energy.
And so that point of threshold is just the stuff where things are significantly changing, right?
Right.
And so to that end, I'm going to throw a big whopper out there and let everybody know that there are 2 lactate thresholds, technically speaking, in exercise physiology.
Yes, commonly accepted. And I would define the first, LT1, as your aerobic threshold. And the second, LT2, some people say anaerobic, or I like the term lactate threshold. And that's the one that's mostly close with FTP. I think, well, I've been around the physiology testing business near 30 years now. The one we used to always identify, the one, was the LT2 anaerobic lactate threshold. It's only really been a little more popularized in the last several years to talk about the aerobic threshold, or LT1.
So if a listener's here and they're like, wait, what? There's 2 lactate thresholds. Where did I miss that? Why is it more commonly talked about now or commonly accepted? Like what's happened recently, or in your opinion, and this is just kind of off the cuff, like, why are we talking about it now? And why is it important for the sake of this conversation?
We have a much greater understanding about physiology, about the pathways for producing energy, and how those training at the different intensities affect different changes in our physiology. I can thank our good pal Inigo San Milan for a lot of his research in the zone 2 in the mitochondrial efficiency and mitochondrial density of the slow twitch muscle fibers. That when I started in this business, we were just like, what's your threshold? What's your your maximal sustainable output? We're going to base all the training around that. And I've evolved over the last 10 years, certainly, of seeing the importance of zone 2 training below that first threshold of your lactate, and what's really going on there. It's just education, more studies. We're not doing things that we did in the 90s or 80s.
Yeah. And I've talked about in the podcast that exercise physiology as a science is actually a very new thing. I mean, 100 years-ish, right? That's when we're really starting to test things and exercise, right, with athletes and things like this. And so keeping that lens on the frame of things here, we have to, I would say, as coaches, as scientists, as physiologists, lean into the fact that as stuff changes, we got to change with it, and we got to educate the users of exercise physiology and the users of our exercise modalities and methods and things like that to help them embrace their training, make them better. So that is why it's important to talk about these two lactate turn points as it frames up exercise physiology and the training that we do. So back to you, Renee. What is the difference between LT1 and LT2?
That is a great question. And as we talked about, we always have some lactate going around. Mm-hmm. And the normal numbers are like 0 to 4. And that's millimoles of lactate per unit of blood. And really, really high would be up in the teens. So just to give you a little scale of that. So you and I sitting here at rest, we hopefully are below 1, 0.8, 0.5. And as we start to exercise, we might go up to 1, 1.5, kind of just like that zone 1, easy. For me, that might be 70 watts. For you, that might be 100 watts, easy. Chill. And let's just say we're exercising, and exercise intensity gets a little harder. And in the lab, we do this on a progressive test where we have certain wattages and we go slowly up in intensity of 55% of FTP or 60% of FTP, etc. So as we are exercising, once we're kind of going easy, let's call it zone 1, 2, our lactates aren't hopefully going to change very much. You might see 1.5, 1.5, 1.5 from 100 watts for you to maybe 170 watts. Kind of a broad range in there where you're exercising harder, but you're able to keep up with those exercise demands by metabolizing fat. Remember, lactate's a byproduct of carbohydrate metabolism, so you haven't needed to get the energy so fast that you're really tapping into the carbohydrates at a high level yet. So same, baseline lactate. And then at some point, and for a lot of people, it's around 70-75% of FTP, somewhere in there. There's an intensity that ticks up, and then all of a sudden, blip, your lactate increases a little bit. But it's not out of control yet. And put in context on numbers, that's like 2 to 3 millimoles for most people. Like 1.5 or lower is easier rest. Over 2 to maybe 3.5 is kind of medium.
And that's how you would determine where LT1 or aerobic threshold would be located during an exercise physiology test.
Yeah. To put it more simply, the first tick up above your baseline. And just, establishing that for most people, when they're going easy, there's a breadth of intensity that they can kind of go a little faster, a little faster, a little harder, and their lactate levels don't climb.
Mm-hmm. And so is it a hard and fast number when you're measuring it there in the lab, or is it a little bit of art that's associated with identifying an LT1?
The more tests I do, the more art I realize. I'm going to be honest, when we started our lab testing way back in the early aughts, we were basing all the stuff that we did off of what they did at the Olympic Training Center. Because why not? They're the best, right? Well, elite athletes test a little different. They present a little different than maybe your active, avid amateur
Weekend
masters,
warrior.
working warrior.
Yeah.
They present differently. And then I get some people who are, I would say more beginner athletes, just kind of almost starting from zero. And their profiles look different. To say that it has to be a half a millimole jump above baseline or 2.0, or I have to use some education and a little art to interpret, like, what is that jump? I talked about these, like, there's some people who come into the lab and their, lactate levels from go are over 2. Like, and they just go up every single stage. That's usually somebody who doesn't have very much aerobic base, to be honest.
Yeah. Because they're not consuming that fat as a fuel source primarily with easier intensities. Is that correct? Just like simplistically stating it.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So we're into LT1. We've started super easy, super chill. You've got them on a bike. They're breathing in apparatus sometimes, but you're definitely taking a lactate sample while the athlete is riding and doing this progressive test that you have them doing. Scale of 1 to 10, how hard would you say their rate of perceived effort is at LT1?
Maybe a 5.
5-ish. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would say it's the first intensity when you notice it. You're like, oh, I'm doing something now.
Yeah.
And, this is going to tie back to, what have we mentioned that LT1 is also what is, determined in the lab to be the top of your zone 2. And below LT1, we talked about the baseline, the lactates are really stable. It kind of feels the same. 100 watts, 120 watts, 130 watts for a lot of folks. Feels the same. And then all of a sudden, maybe it's 150 watts for you, or 170 watts, or, it depends on your fitness level. All of a sudden you're like, oh yeah, I feel like I'm doing something now. Yeah. That's what I say. And that's when you cross over LT1, your lactate levels are a little elevated. So you're starting to use carbohydrates a little bit faster rate. And the other thing that's usually happening, you're talking about breathing, is your respiration ticks up a little bit. You're not like panting and breathing heavy yet, but all of a sudden, like, oh, now I have to take a breath every couple words.
Did we used to call this ventilatory threshold? Do I remember that? Or is that like still different things? Yeah.
It is the same, and they are very close. The ventilatory threshold and LT1.
Yeah.
There's 2 ventilatory thresholds too. So.
Exactly. We won't go there. But that's my point, Renee. And you kind of got there before I did in the way of this LT1 phenomenon. It's a very measurable way of locking in your endurance zone, or where you should train for that zone 2 training. And if people have any questions about where is my zone 2, if you do field testing, you can set that. If you do lab testing, you can set that. And in particular, I think when you were doing lab testing, you can set it and verify it with probably greater confidence based on some of these other exercise metabolism stuff that we're talking about and will talk about in part 2. So it's almost like you can have more assurance that your zone 2 is definitely there if you have a measurable LT1 in a lab test, right?
Right, because you do your standard 20-minute or 8-minute field test. You take a percentage of that you estimate your FTP based off of that field test, and then you take a just raw percentage of, these blocked in 75%, I think it's 74 or 75% would be the top of zone 2 by the, at least the way CTS calculates the zones. And that's just law of averages. Just like 220 minus your age is not your max heart rate for most people. That, 74% of FTP may not be top of your, or your LT1 or top of zone 2, however you want to phrase it.
Yeah, but I would say CTS zones are far more accurate than 220 minus your age.
Yes.
For all the listeners out there, just wanted to put that out there. So anyway, what we're doing and what we're trying to showcase to our listeners here is that a lab test not only shows the performance of the engine, but how the engine is actually performing. And keep in mind, in this little scenario that we're talking about where Renee is performing a test on this Weekend Warrior, we're only at LT1. And what we wanted is to know the LT1 and 2. So as they continue on their exercise, their progressive intensity here, what are you noticing when we're getting close to LT2, Renee? And what are you noticing in the blood? What are you noticing in the rider themselves?
So back to the LT2, what we're calling our classic lactate threshold, or very close to the functional threshold power. So this exercise test, going up at a little higher intensity now, another 20 watts, 30 watts, 40 watts, obviously all dependent, the absolute power dependent on the individual. They're between LT1 and LT2, their lactate levels are up, but you can clear it out as fast as you're making it. It's like, my analogy is you've got a boat in the water. LT1, you got a couple holes in your boat, so you're taking on water, but you've got your bucket, and you're like, I'm getting the water out as fast as it's coming in, no problem. And for like millimole levels, 2 to 3, maybe 3.5 for a lot of people. So it's like, yeah, I'm working harder now. It's in that zone 3 tempo, or maybe up to sweet spot range, if people are familiar with those terms. 80, 85% of FTP. Working hard. I'm noticing it. I can stay here a long time. I can do this for an hour. I can do this for, if I had to, for 2 hours maybe.
Yeah.
So harder, elevated breathing rate, moderate intensity is what I would call it. Moderately hard. Tempo.
Yeah.
And then we get to the point, our bucket's not big enough anymore. We got too many holes in our boat.
Holes. Yeah.
And we're sinking. The lactate threshold, as we're saying, LT2, is the point above which lactate is just out of control. And that's a signal that it's not a flip of the switch. We haven't gone anaerobic. It's a dial. It's not a flip. That we cannot keep up with the energy demands with predominantly aerobic pathways. We need to tap into those anaerobic glycolytic pathways to provide the energy fast enough. And the lactate levels usually jump quite a bit. Now they're like 5, 6, 7, 8 millimoles, high lactates, which are just like, I need the energy so fast. I can't do fat anymore. I have to do just carbohydrate.
Yep.
So essentially above lactate threshold is virtually all carbohydrate metabolism, because we need it so fast. And what the problem is with that, or how that it relates to our exercise intensity, we can only do that so long.
Yeah, because we have limited glycogen stores from carbohydrate on our body, and those will be gone if we consume them quickly.
Right.
Yeah,
exactly.
As opposed to fat, if we're burning fat, we have enough, and even the skinny minis of the endurance athletes out there in the world, we have enough fat on their body to go for days, really.
Yeah, multiple stages of a Tour de France. Yeah.
Yes. And this is why it is important to understand how the engine is running, not just the fact that it is running for a performance standpoint, right? So if we run this test. We have our LT1, we have our LT2. We set our training zones. We know exactly where zone 2 is. We know exactly where zone 4 is. What about FTP? Like, where does that lie? Do you use it anymore? Do you throw it out? Or how do you manage that with your athletes?
I use FTP quite a bit with my athletes because most of my athletes don't live here in town. They might not be able to come
And they
to
don't do
lab.
lab testing. Yeah.
Right. So FTP functional threshold power, it is a, based on your power duration curve. And we have some evidence to back it up based on your performance. It's a little bit more performance based.
Yeah.
And this lactate threshold, it can be a defined number that, your lactate spiked at this number, but what that means to your performance can be a little bit individualized. So FTP functional, I'm actually doing it, applies, but what the lactate numbers are telling us and the lab data is telling us is a little bit more about your physiology. And I'd say, are you training what you think you're training?
Yeah. Yeah.
In particular with the LT1, are you training what you think you're training? Because I think that's probably one of the biggest, I don't know if I would say misconceptions, but misunderstanding about why is zone 2 so important and why isn't doing, depending on your numbers, why isn't 220 better than 180 watts when I'm doing zone 2? When I think I'm doing zone 2.
Yeah. So let's get into that. But first, I'll say this because I'm a big proponent of FTP work because, again, like it is the best marker in the way of performance as it pertains to working with an athlete remotely, working with any athlete with a power meter that's out on the road, doing racing, doing training, and can't get to a lab. And I'll remind everybody it's very highly trainable, both LT and FTP. FTP has some anaerobic as well as aerobic components to it. Okay. So that's one of the differences there. And it has a duration component to it as well, TTE or time to exhaustion. And that's, I would say, the functional aspect of it because we're dealing with a time. And some listeners, perhaps some former listeners, were in a kerfuffle when I talked about TTE as it pertains to FTP, saying that it's not always around an hour or 60 minutes of power. So I bring it up again here in the light of the differences between lab testing and like lactate threshold and FTP. So you can get mad at the truth, but the truth will still be the truth. You're just mad. So I just want to say that before we go, and all that to say, when you're dealing with these two differences, make sure that you are working with a coach that understands the difference between an LT and an FTP, or at least get that information from the practitioner.
I want to piggyback on that a little bit because LT and lactate threshold, LT2, that is a laboratory term.
Yeah.
And if we say my lactate threshold is X, but we haven't done a lab test, we are just estimating it. And like I said, that LT2 does not necessarily signify how long can I hold it. We can make some educated guesses about how long can I hold this LT2.
Right.
And, different labs will call LT2 at a different marker. And even that term LT2 or lactate threshold or anaerobic threshold or OBLA, maximal lactate steady state, if you dig into the literature, you're going to find some different terminology, values, criteria to call these, logarithmic scales or 4.0 millimoles or, a 1 millimole jump, followed by another 1 millimole jump. Like there's different criteria labs will use. So I think, this might be our next conversation about when you do go to a lab, what to look for and how to interpret what their test told you. Because even CTS, we redefined what we determined as lab criteria LT2, lactate threshold, with more information, more knowledge. We basically have it a higher number now. It used to be probably closer to FTP in the sense of 45 minutes to 60-minute power, but now it's probably more in that 35, 45-minute power, depending on the individual. Everything depends on the individual.
Yeah.
I would just want to add, it's where CTS Lab calls LT2 now is a little bit closer to 95% of a 20-minute test.
Yeah. That's a good way of describing it, because again, like whether your FTP is 35 or 60, that's highly dependent on what you've been training, and how your exercise metabolism is working. So let's talk about that, Renee.
Mhm.
So I've done a lab test with you. I have all this new data and this new information. The $1 million question: how do I improve my threshold or thresholds now knowing what I know with the data?
Well, now that you know where your data is, you can more precisely train your energy pathways, your thresholds, if you will. And I think in particular, this timely talk we're having now in the fall, as many people are embarking on their base training, is what really is your zone 2, because the calculations based off FTP, it's a start, but it's not precise. So when you're training below your aerobic threshold, you're producing energy predominantly via the mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cells, mitochondria of the slow twitch muscle fibers, and it is where you're utilizing your greatest amount of fat as fuel.
Yeah. So zone 2, I'm
And
burning far more fat, or should be burning far more fat than carbohydrate.
not necessarily. You're burning the most fat you can.
Gotcha. So fat max.
Right.
Okay.
And I think that's a common misconception. That's a really that oh, I'm all burning fat below in zone 2. No, a lot of folks are 50-50. But it's where where your peak fat or fat oxidation is.
So targeting that intensity where I am burning the most fat possible for myself.
For yourself.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's a very individual mechanism, and there's a lot of things that go into it, but it's all, the control is the mitochondrial density of the slow twitch fibers.
Yep.
And the only way to get more of those is to do more volume of that intensity.
Yeah.
You do have to go hard enough to elicit an aerobic response. For most people, that's 55, 60% of FTP. But if you're going harder than that, you are not more effectively training your body's ability to use fat as a fuel source. You're actually not doing that. You're doing the opposite of that. Because once you cross over that first threshold, now all of a sudden the extra energy I'm expending is coming from carbohydrates.
Yep.
And your fat percentage starts going down. So that's why training in zone 2 is better than zone 3 for that mitochondrial efficiency of your slow twitch fibers, and that's the control mechanism of your, for lack of a better term, your aerobic base.
Yeah, base training, which training. I've talked about quite a bit on this podcast. And again, like zone 2 is pretty hypey right now. I think for the better, because it's we've talked about intensity for years and years, and intensity definitely has its role, definitely has its place to move the needle forward on fitness. I'm a big proponent of intensity, but not until that base is built properly. And so I think to all of this end, like you said, Renee, like, going hard enough to elicit a response. It's not just like the coffee ride, right? You're probably not hitting fat max on a coffee ride, but what polarized, I would say, training has brought to us is it's not super, super easy, but it's probably easier than you're going. How do I know? Do a lab test.
The LT2 and the FTP, we talked about how close they are. That I think it is really good information to get the full lactate profile, but what you're not getting from your 5-minute, 20-minute, 8-minute power tests is, where is that LT1 for me? Yeah. And like, we'll get into it even more in our next conversation. Where is my peak fat oxidation rate? Well, top of zone 2 is theoretically close to where your peak fat oxidation rate is. I actually find it's not the case for a lot of individual athletes. A lot of those, the literature you might read is based off of studies, and those studies are based off of probably like high-level athletes that were
usually
tested.
leads.
Yeah, I see some people's fat oxidation being 55 or 60% of their FTP. I call those guys sugar burners.
Yeah.
And for
probably
that
ate a
person,
cookie.
and that person needs they need to do more base training.
Yeah.
Or they have a bigger deficit there. So probably if I had one takeaway I hope people got from this is that if you go easier on your zone 2 rides, it's probably going to be better for you, because too hard, you're not doing what you think you're doing. You're too hard, you're starting to burn more carbohydrates than fat. You're not getting that adaptation on the mitochondria of your slow twitch fibers. At some point in time, people do need to progress from their zone 2. But if you're just starting your base training now and you haven't done a bunch of zone 2 training, you would benefit from it. And a little easier is a lot better than a little harder when we're talking about those adaptations.
Yeah. Yeah, completely agree. And I think as well, what's also challenging to do is talk about some of this, the metabolism of it, which we'll do in part 2. And so I would encourage everyone to definitely tune into part 2 as we just keep on bringing home these take-home messages of the basics of physiology, why we test what we test, why we set up training zones as we are, and understand the value of zone 2 training and how it can be different from one person to the next. Because if anything that you do take away is just fully understanding that, you have 2 thresholds. One is aerobic and the other one is anaerobic. It's actually at that floor of that anaerobic threshold, right? And so you can think about organizing your physiology in those 2 ways, but each one can have a lot of variance depending on your own individual metabolism. And that's when lab testing differs from field testing. Also, just to kind of summarize the points, is once you know your LT1, LT2, you have more confidence. You have training zones to now go out and deploy the training, but now you need the plan. And what Renee and I are talking about is, as we're turning the corner of 2023 here and thinking about that base training, and as Renee, you're working with your athletes, I'm sure everybody is starting to think about how to do base training better or how to be more targeted. So anything else you want to add to that summary list?
A couple more selling points on the zone 2. Zone 2 in improving that mitochondrial function at the slow twitch fibers, and moving that, the goal is to move it up so that it's a higher workload, a higher percent of your LT2. I think I told you about this guy I tested yesterday, elite athlete, like one of the best ultra runners in the country. His LT1 in peak fat oxidation was within 90% of his LT2. That's awesome. That would be ideal. You want to push bonkers. It. The other thing about like training the lower is it affects everything aerobically. Like it will help you improve your LT2 and improves your VO2 max, because the major controller of your aerobic performance is that mitochondrial function of your slow twitch fibers. Yeah. We need the other intensities. We need the LT2 work, the VO2 max work. But if you're trying to improve your base, you've got to be training ideally at kind of a steady effort below your LT1. And I'm sorry, guys, you can't do that on your group ride.
Putting the kibosh on the group ride, just like a good coach always does.
Unless you can get all your buddies to agree to ride at like a nice, steady, easy tempo. I'm having that conversation with a few people this week. That's why it came up. Yeah. It's like, you're not doing what you think you're doing when you're going out on these 3-hour hammer fests.
Yeah, they're fun. They're fun. And you'll be able to hammer more if you do your zone 2 better, or if you actually do your zone 2. So yeah, for everyone, I think you're getting the message of zone 2. I mean, it's super popular right now. A lot of people are talking about it, but I'm not always hearing why it's important and what is the underlying physiology behind it. So by doing these next few podcasts, I hope that we can really tell you the why of what we're trying to achieve. And that's going to help set you up really good for a successful base training season. So,
right. And
Renee,
zone 2 is fun. It's nice and easy. You don't feel wrecked after it. It's
absolutely.
awesome.
You have so much
like
more
every
energy
day.
in the day. So much more energy in the day, which I love, because if you do go out and you just like super mix of zone 3 and 4 on hills, and you come back and you just like gorge your, just like pull everything out of the fridge, go for it, and then try to go back to work, and then you start falling asleep and you're not happy at all. So, Renee, thank you very much for being on the podcast once again. We'll save all the contacts and socials until our next episode, but I'm going to post them in the show notes. So if anyone's like, wait, this Renee, like I need a lab test, I'm going to reach out. Check out the show notes and you'll find everything about Renee that you need to.
Thanks, Adam.
Thanks, Renee.